The invisible girl with golden hands. The city moved at a rhythm Amara Lewis had long since memorized. The rumble of buses shoving past intersections, the impatient honking of cars caught in jams, the scrape of shoes against wet pavement, all blended into a background symphony she carried with her each day. To most, these sounds meant stress, deadlines, schedules, or wealth speeding by in tinted sedans. But to her, they were survival cues. She listened closely because listening had kept her alive. At 15 years old, she had already learned what others might take decades to realize. The world rarely notices the ones it has already decided don't matter. That invisibility, sharp and cold as it was also her shield. Wrapped in her oversized hoodie with its frayed cuffs, she was just another forgotten shadow in the alleys. Another young girl overlooked as people hurried by with eyes fixed firmly ahead, careful never to meet the gaze of someone whose existence reminded them of everything they wished to ignore. Amara pressed herself deeper into the doorway of a shuttered shop as a sleek black car glided past. The puddle beside her splashed high against the curb, soaking through the holes in her battered sneakers. She didn't flinch. Cold water was no stranger. Her gaze, though, clung to the car as it curved around the corner, its engine humming like a living beast, perfectly tuned and arrogant in its smoothness. She could tell even at a distance that this wasn't just another luxury vehicle that rolled out of showrooms for executives. No, this was an older model, one of those restored treasures that carried a sound you couldn't fake. Most people only noticed the polish, the gleam of chrome, the smell of leather, but she listened deeper beneath the roar into the heartbeat of machines. She heard engines the way others heard melodies. Her hand shifted to the strap of the backpack slung across her thin shoulders. Inside, carefully wrapped in scraps of cloth, were the tools she had collected like relics. A socket wrench salvaged from a dumpster behind a mechanic's shop, a pair of wire strippers she had bartered for with 3 days' worth of aluminum cans, screwdrivers scavenged from abandoned toolboxes. Each tool was more than metal. They were the only inheritance she carried, the continuation of lessons passed down from her father before the world stole him away. Marcus Lewis had not been a rich man. He had worked at a small garage in Detroit, content with grease under his nails and engines under his care. Yet to Amara he had been a genius. She could still see him perched at his workbench, explaining carburetors with words simple enough for a little girl to follow, his laughter booming as he wiped his hands and told her, "Engines are like people, baby girl. They'll always tell you what's wrong if you just learn how to listen." His voice lingered in her memory like smoke, clinging to her ribs even years after the accident that had ended his life, and scattered hers into the foster system. The system had never been a home. Houses blurred into one another, rules and punishment stacking until she chose the streets. Harsh freedom was still better than cages disguised as care. Her only steady companion now was Bolt, the scruffy mutt who followed her faithfully, his ribs sharp under his mangy fur, yet his spirit unbroken. Tonight, as she whispered his name, his tail wagged once before he pressed against her leg, urging her toward the safety of their makeshift shelter. Together they wound through alleys, past graffiti-stained walls and dumpsters that reeked of yesterday's meals. Their destination was an abandoned garage on the city's edge, its roof leaking, its windows cracked, but to them it was sanctuary. Within its broken walls she could spread out her tools, light a stub of candle, and let her world expand beyond hunger and cold. That night, she placed before her a broken radio pulled from a recycling bin. Its wires hung loose like veins cut open, its casing cracked, but where others saw waste, she saw possibility. She lit the candle, the weak flame barely holding against the drafts, and set to work. Her hands moved with quiet certainty, stripping, reconnecting, aligning. Each motion carried echoes of her father's guidance, instincts sharpened by years of watching, listening, experimenting in secret corners of the city. Hours passed unnoticed until static gave way to sound, soft jazz filling the hollow garage, notes spilling warmth into her chest. For a moment it felt like Sunday mornings again, her father humming under his breath while adjusting an old carburetor. Life simple and whole. The memory hurt, but it also kept her steady. She would trade this radio tomorrow for food. For now, though, she savored the victory. Across town, in a penthouse that touched the clouds, Richard Harlow stood before a wall of glass, his reflection merging with the cityscape. At 48, he embodied the ruthless precision of success. His empire stretched across real estate and technology, his wealth measured in billions, his reputation both admired and feared. Yet tonight, as rain traced lines down the windows, his mind wasn't on profit margins or contracts. It was on a race. The annual charity Grand Prix loomed only weeks away, and unlike the other billionaires who treated it as spectacle, Richard saw it as something else entirely. For him, it was legacy. In the vast private garage below, under a custom cover, waited the object of his obsession, a 1967 Falcon, midnight blue, restored to perfection at staggering cost. His father, William Harlow, had begun the restoration decades ago but died before finishing. To Richard, the car wasn't just metal and bolts. It was unfinished business. It was the dream of a man who had believed in speed, precision, and excellence. To lose in this race, or worse, to fail to even start, would not only damage his reputation, it would desecrate his father's memory. Sir Victor Brennan, his lead mechanic, entered the garage quietly. A man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, Victor carried the calm of experience, though Richard had noticed the tremor in his hands when he thought no one watched. "We've scheduled another test run this afternoon," Victor reported, his voice steady but his eyes betraying fatigue. "It needs to be perfect," Richard replied, his gaze fixed on the Falcon's curves. "The press will be there. The investors are watching. This car cannot fail again." But what Richard didn't know was that the Falcon harbored a flaw none of his expert team could diagnose. The engine would roar to life, flawless for minutes, then stall into silence without explanation. They had replaced parts, checked timing, adjusted connections, but each test ended in the same humiliating breakdown. For 3 weeks, the brightest minds money could buy had stood defeated before the stubborn machine. Meanwhile, Amara's world rotated differently. The next morning, she bartered the radio at Murphy's diner, exchanging it for a meal and a few crumpled bills. As she stepped back into the gray drizzle, she overheard 2 mechanics leaning against a truck outside. Their voices were thick with frustration. "We've been at it 3 days, one muttered. "Engine's cursed. Runs fine for a few minutes, then dies. Checked everything twice." The other spat tobacco juice into the gutter. "Boss'll skin us alive. Nothing makes sense." Amara froze, the words striking her like lightning. In her mind, she could already hear the sputter, the cough of an engine starved. "Vapor lock in the fuel line," she whispered before she could stop herself. "Blocked return valve. Pressure buildup." Bolt barked softly as though agreeing. Of course, the men didn't hear her. They climbed into their truck and drove off, leaving Amara with the ache of knowledge trapped in silence. Who would listen to a homeless teenager? Who would believe her? That night, unable to shake the mystery, she walked to the junkyard on Riverside Avenue. Carl, the gruff owner, let her tinker in exchange for repairs he could resell. As she dug through a heap of alternators, the sound of an approaching convoy reached her ears. Police motorcycles first, their lights flashing, followed by a pristine transport truck. Through gaps in the fence, Amara glimpsed it, the midnight blue Falcon gleaming like a jewel in the dim light. Her breath caught. She ran alongside the fence, Bolt trotting at her heels to catch one more glimpse as it turned toward the industrial district. The image burned in her mind. That car wasn't just beautiful. It was alive, a puzzle begging to be solved. She knew then that this machine would not leave her thoughts. Somewhere deep within her, a spark ignited, the reckless, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, she was meant to be the one who understood it. And so the paths of a forgotten girl and a billionaire bound by legacy inched closer, their collision inevitable, though neither yet knew how completely it would change both their worlds. The meeting of worlds. The rain had not stopped in 2 days, and Amara had grown used to the chill that clung to her bones. She sat on the edge of the park bench near Hamilton Square, pulling her hoodie tighter as Bolt curled up against her side. She had just finished a trade with an old cook at the diner, and was waiting for the traffic to thin before heading back to her garage. Yet as she sat there, she noticed something unusual. A girl not much older than herself sitting a few benches down, her luggage piled neatly beside her, her posture elegant, but her eyes red from crying. Amara's instinct told her to look away. The last thing she needed was trouble from someone who clearly belonged to another world, a world cushioned by wealth and privilege. But there was something in the girl's expression, a loneliness too raw to ignore, that drew Amara in. She hesitated before speaking, her voice careful and low. "You okay?" The girl startled, quickly brushing her tears with the back of her hand. She had light brown hair tied into a neat braid, her clothes clean, her shoes polished, and a faint perfume lingering in the damp air. She looked at Amara with surprise, almost as if she hadn't expected someone like her to speak. Yes, no, I don't know, she stammered, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. Amara tilted her head. Parents? She asked, because that was usually the root of a teenager's tears. The girl let out a bitter chuckle. Try a father who cares more about an old car than his own daughter. He sent a driver to fetch me from school instead of showing up himself. Guess his machines mean more to him than I ever will. Amara's heart tightened at the mention of an old car. Her mind flashed back to the midnight blue Falcon she had glimpsed at the junkyard fence. A car? She asked, her curiosity slipping past her caution. The girl sighed, shaking her head. Some vintage thing that belonged to my grandfather. Dad's been obsessed with fixing it for months. It's for some charity race like anybody cares. She glanced at Amara, almost searching for validation. Do you know how pathetic it feels when an engine gets more attention than you? Amara swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. This girl had to be talking about the same car, the one the mechanics had been failing to repair, the one that seemed like a living mystery calling to her. She suddenly realized who she must be sitting beside. What's your name? Amara asked cautiously. Lena, the girl said, her voice softening. Lena Harlow. The name landed like a thunderclap. Amara felt her stomach twist. Harlow, of course. The billionaire's daughter. The man whose car had haunted her thoughts since she'd first seen it. For a moment she considered running, leaving before she said too much. But Lena was watching her closely, her expression weary but curious. Amara forced a small smile. I'm Amy, she lied, not ready to trust this stranger with her real name. You live around here, Amy? Lena asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wasn't simple. Here and there, Amara replied vaguely, not wanting to reveal that her home was an abandoned garage. She hesitated, then added, So what's wrong with the car? Lena blinked in surprise. How did you know something was wrong with it? You said your dad's been spending millions on it, Amara said with a shrug. Usually means something's broken. She kept her tone casual, but inside she burned with certainty. She knew exactly what was wrong, even without touching it. She could still hear the sound of that sputtering engine in her head. Lena stared at her as though weighing whether to continue. Finally, she stood, brushing her skirt. I should go. My father's driver is probably looking for me. She lifted her bags and offered Amara a small, almost apologetic smile before walking away. Amara sat frozen on the bench long after Lena left. Her thoughts tumbled like gears slipping out of alignment. She had been right. The Falcon was failing and the mechanics couldn't solve it. And now she had stumbled across the one person who might unknowingly give her a path closer to it. But what could she do? She was just a homeless girl with a backpack full of scavenged tools. Who would believe her? That night, curiosity and desperation warred within her. For hours, she stared at her sketches by candlelight. The diagrams she had drawn of the Falcon from memory. She retraced every possibility, every potential fault. Her pencil racing across the paper as if the car itself were whispering secrets into her ear. Engines wanted to run. That was what her father had always told her. When they didn't, it was because something was stopping them from being what they were meant to be. And this Falcon, this proud machine, was choking itself. She could feel it as if it were alive beneath her hands. Sleep never came, and so with Bolt padding beside her, she wandered toward the wealthy part of the city as dawn crept across the skyline. The Harlow estate rose like a fortress of glass and steel, ringed with tall gates and cameras. Amara knew better than to get too close, but she couldn't help herself. She found a spot across the street where decorative trees offered cover. And through the glowing windows of the garage complex she saw the mechanics bent over the Falcon, frustration etched into their movements. They were checking the same things over and over, missing the heart of the problem. She opened her notebook and began sketching feverishly, charting their steps, correcting them in the margins. She didn't even notice when a hand landed on her shoulder. She spun, nearly crying out, until she saw Lena standing there in her school jacket, looking both confused and concerned. Amy? Lena whispered. What are you doing here? Amara's mind raced for an excuse, but honesty slipped out before she could stop it. I wanted to see the car. Lena frowned, her eyes dropping to the notebook in Amara's hands. She flipped it open before Amara could stop her. and gasped at the diagrams within, detailed sketches of the Falcon's fuel system, annotated with notes and corrections. "You drew these?" Amara's cheeks burned, but she nodded. "These are incredible," Lena breathed. "You can tell all this just from looking?" "I've studied engines my whole life," Amara admitted softly, though the words carried weight beyond her years. Lena's eyes lit with an excitement Amara hadn't expected. "Do you want to see it up close?" "What?" Amara froze. "No, I couldn't. I don't belong here." "Come on," Lena urged, grabbing her hand with the kind of impulsive confidence only the rich carried. "Dad's in his office. He won't come down for hours. There's a service entrance the mechanics use. I'll sneak you in." Every instinct screamed at Amara to run, but the pull of the Falcon was too strong, the possibility too tempting. Against the voice of caution, she let Lena lead her through the shadows to a side door. Lena punched in a code, and suddenly Amara found herself standing in the Harlow garage, surrounded by gleaming tools she'd only ever seen in catalogs. And there, in the center of the spotless floor, bathed in perfect lighting, was the Falcon. Midnight blue, every curve polished to perfection, yet to Amara's eyes its beauty was laced with pain. She approached it reverently, her breath catching. This close she could see it, the subtle misalignment in the fuel system, the regulator positioned wrong, the return line choking itself. "The fuel injection system," she murmured, almost to herself. "The pressure regulator's out of sequence, and the return line," she crouched, peering beneath. "It's creating a feedback loop. That's why it runs for a while and then dies. The system's literally strangling itself." Lena stared at her in awe. "You can tell that just by looking?" "Not just looking," Amara whispered, her hand resting lightly on the engine block as though listening for its heartbeat. "Engines talk. You just have to feel them. This one's been screaming to be heard." Before Lena could respond, footsteps echoed from the main entrance. Both girls froze. "Someone's coming," Lena hissed. "We have to go." They slipped out the way they came, running until they were blocks away, their breaths ragged with adrenaline. Lena doubled over, laughing breathlessly. "That was insane. I've never done anything like that before." Amara shook her head, guilt and exhilaration tangled within her. "I should go. I don't belong in your world." "Wait." Lena grabbed her arm, her green eyes burning with determination. "Meet me tomorrow. Same bench. I want to know more about what you saw." Amara hesitated. Trust was a luxury she rarely allowed herself. But something about Lena's tone, earnest, unguarded, made her nod. "Okay," she whispered. As she walked back to her garage, Bolt trotting beside her, she felt something strange stir within her chest. Hope, the kind she hadn't dared to feel in years. The unseen truth. The following afternoon came with skies as heavy as Amara's thoughts. She sat on the bench at Hamilton Park where she and Lena had agreed to meet. Her backpack clutched tightly against her chest, as though it could protect her from the possibilities of what might come. Bolt lay at her feet, gnawing lazily on a stick, but his ears twitched whenever Amara shifted nervously. She was not used to waiting for people, not like this. On the streets, time was survival. You moved fast, you didn't linger where questions could be asked. But here she was, sitting openly in the park like someone who belonged to routines and promises, all because Lena Harlow had asked her to. When Lena finally arrived, she carried herself differently than the day before. There was still a weariness in her eyes, but now it was layered with something sharper: curiosity, determination. She wore a neat school blazer and carried a tablet in one hand, though she shoved it carelessly into her bag when she spotted Amara. "You came," Lena said, a little breathless as if she hadn't been sure. Amara shrugged, her eyes flicking away. "You asked." Lena sat beside her, her voice lowering. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said yesterday. The way you touched the engine like it was alive. You sounded so sure. My father's mechanics have been working for weeks and haven't figured anything out. But you knew in seconds." Amara pressed her lips together, resisting the urge to explain. It felt dangerous to show too much. Knowledge was both a weapon and a vulnerability when you lived invisible. Still, the truth slipped out. Engines tell stories if you know how to listen. Most people just look at parts. I listen to what's between the sounds. Lena leaned closer. "Then maybe you're the one who can help. Dad won't admit it, but the race is everything to him. If the car fails, he'll be humiliated. He's already furious at his team. If you could just show him. Amara laughed without humor. Show him? You think a man like Richard Harlow is going to listen to a homeless girl? He'd throw me out before I open my mouth. Not if I introduce you, Lena said quickly. He trusts me more than he lets on. And if he sees what you can do, or he'll think you're playing games and lock me out forever. Amara interrupted, shaking her head. I've been laughed at before, Lena. By adults, by mechanics who think I don't know anything because of how I look. I'm not walking into a lion's den just to be torn apart. But Lena's gaze was unwavering. You might be the only one who can fix that car. Isn't it worth trying? The words echoed in Amara's chest long after she left the park. That night, she sat in her garage with Bolt at her feet staring at her sketches spread across the floor. Her father's voice came to her, clear as if he were in the room. Engines are like people, baby girl. They'll tell you what's wrong if you just listen. She had listened, she knew. The Falcon's flaw was right there, screaming to anyone who had the ears to hear, but the question gnawed at her. What good was knowing if the world refused to believe her? Across the city, in the polished boardroom of Harlow Industries, Richard Harlow sat at the head of a table surrounded by investors. The air was tense, thick with disapproval. $3 million, David Steinberg said sharply, his voice clipped. That's what you've sunk into this car in 6 months. And what do we have to show for it? A machine that stalls every time it's tested. It's becoming a joke, Patricia Moore added, her manicured nails clicking against her tablet. People are calling it Harlow's folly. That's not the kind of press our company needs. Richard's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against the polished wood of the table. That car was my father's dream. It will be ready. It will race, and it will win. If you don't have a solution soon, Richard, Steinberg warned, the board will reconsider its confidence in you. Richard dismissed them with a glare sharp enough to silence further protest. But as the investors filed out, their whispers stung. Money pit, obsession, losing his edge. He returned to his office and called Victor Brennan. Status report now. Victor's exhausted voice crackled through the speaker. We've been working nonstop, sir. The team suspects an issue with the fuel injection system, but we can't identify the root. I don't want excuses, Victor. I want results, sir. Perhaps we should consider replacing the engine entirely. We could source a modern one, modify it to look original. No. Richard's voice snapped like a whip. That engine stays. It's the heart of the car. Without it, the Falcon means nothing. Find the problem or I'll find someone who can. The call ended, leaving Richard staring out at the city. He wouldn't admit it aloud, but fear gnawed at him. Somewhere, someone had the answer. He just had no idea that someone was a 15-year-old girl sketching by candlelight in a forgotten garage. The next evening, Lena appeared at the park bench again, more insistent than ever. You have to come, she urged Amara. If Dad sees you near the car, if you explain, Amara shook her head. He'll laugh in my face. Not if you prove it, Lena countered. You saw what the mechanics missed. Show them, make them listen. You deserve to be heard. There was something in Lena's voice, a conviction Amara hadn't expected. It was strange to feel believed in by someone who lived a life so different from hers. Against her instincts, Amara agreed. That night, Lena smuggled her back into the garage. The Falcon sat under the harsh lights, silent, proud, wounded. Around it, mechanics moved with weary frustration, their faces grim. Amara stayed in the shadows, notebook clutched tight, until Lena whispered, Now. Gathering her courage, Amara stepped forward. The room froze. Grease-stained men in expensive coveralls turned to stare at the girl in torn sneakers and a hoodie too large for her. Murmurs rose. Who's this? What is she doing here? Richard Harlow himself emerged from the office above, his eyes narrowing at the sight of her. Lena, he said sharply. Explain. She can help, Lena blurted, stepping in front of Amara. Dad, she knows what's wrong with the car. The garage erupted in laughter. The mechanics exchanged incredulous glances. One of them scoffed, What is this, a joke? We've been tearing this thing apart for weeks, and you bring in, what, a kid off the street? Amara's face burned, but she stood her ground. She stepped closer to the car, ignoring their mockery, and laid her palm gently against the engine. She could almost feel its sigh beneath her touch. The fuel injection system, she said firmly. You've got the pressure regulator in the wrong sequence. The return line is creating a feedback loop. That's why it runs fine for a few minutes and then dies. The system is choking itself. The room fell into stunned silence. Then the laughter resumed, harsher this time. "What does she know?" one mechanic jeered. "A street rat telling us our jobs?" Richard's voice cut through the noise, icy and controlled. "Who are you?" Amara lifted her chin. Her voice trembled, but her words did not. "If you permit, I will try." The room went still. The audacity of the sentence hung heavy in the air. Richard's eyes, cold and calculating, studied her with the same scrutiny he used on contracts and rivals. Finally he said, "Get her out," Lena gasped. "Dad, enough," Richard snapped. "I don't have time for games. This car is legacy, not a toy for your friend." Security moved forward, but Amara didn't flinch. She gathered her notebook, clutched Bolt's leash, and walked out with her head held high, though inside humiliation burned like fire. She had spoken the truth, and still they had laughed. But as she disappeared into the night, Victor Brennan lingered by the Falcon, troubled. For all his years of experience, he couldn't shake the precision in the girl's words. Wrong sequence. Feedback loop. It gnawed at him, unsettling, like an engine knock he couldn't unhear. And so, the unseen truth began to work its way through the cracks of doubt, waiting for the moment when even pride and money would be forced to listen to a homeless girl no one wanted to see. The trial by fire. The night after Amara was thrown out of the Harlow garage, the city felt colder than usual. She walked through rain-slicked alleys with Bolt trotting beside her, her notebook clutched to her chest like a fragile piece of armor. The humiliation still echoed in her mind, the laughter of the mechanics, the cold dismissal in Richard Harlow's voice, the sting of being reduced to a joke. Yet beneath the pain was something fiercer, something that refused to die. She knew she was right. Engines never lied. People did. Pride did. But machines told the truth, and the Falcon had whispered that truth directly into her hands. Back in her garage, she spread her sketches across the floor once more. The candlelight flickered across the diagrams she had drawn, every line etched with certainty. She could see it so clearly. The flawed sequencing, the choking return line, the way the engine starved itself after minutes of perfect performance. She ran her finger over the page, whispering to herself, "If you permit, I will try." The words felt heavier now. Not just a plea, but a vow. She had asked permission from a man who did not believe in her. But maybe when desperation broke his walls, he would remember her. Across the city, desperation was indeed beginning to seep into Richard Harlow's fortress. The Falcon had failed yet again during its latest test run. Reporters were beginning to circle like vultures, sniffing at the promise of scandal. Investors were losing patience. And for Richard, whose identity was intertwined with his father's legacy, the thought of rolling the Falcon into the Grand Prix only to have it stall publicly was unbearable. Failure wasn't an option, but neither was giving up. He had poured millions into this machine. He had commanded the best mechanics in the country to work on it. And yet the car defied them all. Victor Brennan, exhausted and defeated, stood in the garage with his team. They had stripped and rebuilt the system 3 times over, checked every connection, replaced every component they could source. Nothing worked. Each failure deepened the lines on his face, each silence after a sputtering stall cut into him like a blade. And in the quiet moments when he was alone, he thought of the girl, the way she had spoken, precise and unwavering. Her explanation as clean as any engineer's report. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but her words haunted him. Wrong sequence. Feedback loop. He had dismissed her because Richard had dismissed her, but now, with nothing left, he found himself turning those words over in his mind. By dawn, Richard summoned his daughter to his office. Lena entered cautiously, but her chin was lifted in defiance. "The car failed again," Richard said without preamble, his tone clipped cold. Lena folded her arms. "Then maybe you should listen to the girl you threw out." Richard's jaw tightened. "We are not having this conversation again." "Yes, we are," Lena shot back, surprising even herself with the force in her voice. "You care more about that car than you care about people, Dad." She knew what was wrong. "I saw it. The mechanics didn't. And you humiliated her just because of where she comes from. If you lose this race, it won't be because the Falcon failed. It will be because you were too proud to listen." Her words cut through him sharper than the criticism of investors or the whispers of the press. For a moment, Richard saw not his daughter but his wife years ago, standing in the same place with the same fire in her eyes. He had lost her to an illness money couldn't fight, and ever since he had buried his vulnerability under steel. Now his daughter's defiance pierced through the armor he had built. "She's just a child," Richard muttered, more to himself than to Lena. "So am I," Lena replied fiercely. "And I can see she's a genius. You asked the best mechanics in the world and they failed. What do you have to lose by letting her try?" Richard turned away, pacing to the window, watching the storm clouds roll over the skyline. The thought was madness. A homeless girl, barely 15, touching the engine his father had left him. The risk was unthinkable. And yet, what if she was right? What if his refusal to hear her condemned the Falcon to silence? That evening, the Falcon was tested once more for the press. Cameras flashed as the car roared to life, its growl filling the air with promise. But less than 5 minutes into the run, the sound faltered, sputtered, and died. The silence that followed was more deafening than the engine's roar. Reporters scribbled furiously, investors shook their heads, and Richard's vision blurred with rage and humiliation. He dismissed everyone, retreating to the garage as the mechanics avoided his eyes. For hours, he stood before the Falcon, staring at its still form. He saw his father's hands in every polished line, every restored part, every curve of steel. He heard his father's laughter, remembered his voice telling him that some dreams were worth everything. And now here it was, dead. It was Lena who broke the silence. She stepped into the garage, her voice steady despite the storm in her father's eyes. "You're willing to lose everything," she said quietly, "but you won't listen to the only person who can save you." Richard closed his eyes. He wanted to dismiss her words, to command silence, but he couldn't. Not this time. Finally, he exhaled and spoke with the weariness of a man cornered. "Bring her." When Amara arrived, escorted reluctantly by Lena, she felt the weight of every gaze upon her. The mechanics looked at her with open disdain, some shaking their heads, others crossing their arms as if to wall themselves against humiliation. Richard stood near the car, his posture rigid, his eyes hard. "You have one night," he said. "If you fail, you leave and never come back." Amara's breath caught, but she nodded. "If you permit, I will try." The garage held its breath as she approached the Falcon. Her fingers brushed lightly against the hood, tracing the polished steel before she knelt beside the engine. She opened her backpack, pulling out her tools, each one worn and mismatched, wrapped in scraps of cloth. The mechanics laughed under their breath at the sight of them, but she ignored them. She wasn't here for them. She was here for the Falcon. For hours she worked in silence, her brow furrowed, her movements precise. She stripped the lines, realigned the regulator, rerouted the feedback loop. She improvised with what she had, creating solutions out of scraps and instinct. She spoke softly as she worked, not to the people watching but to the engine itself, murmuring encouragement the way her father had once done. "You want to run? I know you do. Just a little more and you'll breathe free." By midnight, sweat streaked her face and her hands ached, but the system was reassembled. She stepped back, wiped her brow, and looked at Richard. "Start it." Victor hesitated, then climbed into the driver's seat. The key turned. The engine coughed, then roared to life, its growl steady, powerful, unbroken. The sound filled the garage, echoing off the walls, pure and strong. Minutes passed. The Falcon held. No sputter, no stall. The laughter of the mechanics had died. Now silence reigned except for the song of the engine, steady as a heartbeat. Richard's eyes widened, his stoic mask cracking for the first time in years. He could feel it. The difference, the life restored to the machine his father had loved. Amara stood with her arms crossed, her chin lifted. For the first time she wasn't invisible. For the first time her gift had been seen. Richard finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "It's fixed." Amara's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "No," she said quietly. "It's alive." The race that changed everything. Morning rose over the city like a curtain lifting on a stage. The air hummed with anticipation, as though even the streets knew what was coming. For weeks the press had speculated about Richard Harlow's obsession, about the millions poured into a car that refused to live. Reporters had already drafted their headlines, poised to crown the Falcon a symbol of vanity and failure. What none of them knew was that a homeless girl with a backpack of scavenged tools had worked through the night to breathe life into that machine. Amara awoke on the floor of the Harlow garage, curled against Bolt with her notebook under her arm. She hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had claimed her after hours of wrenching, aligning, and testing. The sound of footsteps stirred her, and she blinked up to see Lena standing there, smiling with pride that seemed to warm the entire space. "You did it," Lena whispered as though still afraid to break the spell. "It ran all night without stalling. They tested it at dawn. It's holding." Amara rubbed her tired eyes, her mind catching up to the words. The Falcon was alive. She had been right. She had proven it. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine what her father would say, if he could see her now. The thought brought a sting of tears, but she blinked them away quickly. Today was not a day for grief. It was a day for triumph. By mid-morning, the Harlow estate was a hive of activity. Cameramen, reporters, mechanics, and investors buzzed around like restless bees. The Falcon gleamed under its cover, waiting to be revealed. Richard Harlow stood stiff and immaculate in a tailored suit, his expression carved from stone as he addressed his team. He didn't mention Amara, he didn't thank her. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. But Lena, standing beside him, shot her a glance that said more than words ever could. Amara understood. Pride was a slow-moving beast, and Richards had not yet bent enough to speak her name. That was fine. She hadn't fixed the car for glory. She had done it because engines deserved to run, because silence where there should have been sound was a crime she could not abide. The convoy arrived at the race course by noon. The Grand Prix was no ordinary competition. It was a spectacle where the richest men and women in the world flaunted their toys under the banner of charity. The stands overflowed with celebrities, politicians, and business tycoons, their laughter echoing against the steel of the bleachers. Cameras tracked every movement. Commentators filled the airwaves with speculation, and down in the pit lanes, drivers preened beside their machines like gladiators awaiting combat. When the Falcon was rolled into its position, a hush rippled through the crowd. Everyone had heard the rumors. Everyone expected disaster. More than one rival smirked at the sight of Richard Harlow, assuming the man's pride would finally unravel before their eyes. Richard himself stood impassive, but inside, his pulse thudded like a drum. He glanced once toward the far edge of the pit, where Amara sat on a tool crate with Bolt at her feet, her hoodie pulled up as if to shield her from the world. She didn't belong here, not by the standards of wealth and spectacle, but in truth, she belonged more than anyone else. Engines roared to life around them, the thunder of horsepower filling the air like war drums. When the Falcon's ignition turned, its midnight blue body shuddered, and then the engine roared smooth and steady, as though it had never known silence. Richard's chest tightened, a rush of relief flooding him even as he forced his face to remain unreadable. He climbed into the driver's seat himself, his knuckles gripping the wheel, his father's dream finally alive beneath his hands. The flag dropped. Cars leapt forward, screaming down the track, each one a marvel of engineering and wealth. The Falcon surged alongside them, its acceleration clean, its handling smooth, its voice steady as a song. For lap after lap it held, weaving through tight corners, hugging the track like it had been born for it. Commentators gasped, investors leaned forward, the crowd roared. And Amara, watching from the sidelines, felt her heart hammer in time with the car's rhythm. Every growl of the engine was a vindication, every seamless lap proof that she had been right when no one believed her. By the final lap, it was no longer just a race. It was a resurrection. The Falcon crossed the finish line in second place, close enough to silence every critic, strong enough to restore Richard's reputation, flawless enough to remind the world that his father's dream still lived. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and Lena threw her arms around Amara, laughing through tears. "You did it," she whispered fiercely. "We did it." On the podium, Richard accepted the applause with a nod, his face still hard but his eyes betraying something softer, something shaken. When the reporters pressed in, demanding to know how the Falcon had finally been fixed after so many failures, he hesitated. His pride warred with truth. And then slowly, deliberately he gestured toward the pit where Amara sat with her dog. "She did," Richard said, his voice carrying over the microphones. "That girl saved my father's car." Gasps rippled through the crowd as cameras swung toward Amara. For a moment she froze, every instinct telling her to shrink into invisibility. But Lena tugged her forward, her hand steady, her smile fierce. And so Amara stood in the blinding light of the world for the first time, her hoodie pulled back, her notebook still clutched against her chest. Reporters surged, flashes burned, questions tumbled over one another. But all she could hear was the steady hum of the falcon cooling beside them, alive because she had listened. Richard stepped down from the podium, his pride cracked open at last. He faced her directly, his voice low enough that only she and Lena could hear. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words heavy as lead. "And more than that, I owe you a chance. If you want it," Amara blinked, struggling to process. "A chance?" "A place in my garage, training, education, a future." He hesitated, then added, "No one should waste a gift like yours." For a long moment, Amara was silent. She thought of the night spent in an abandoned garage, of hunger gnawing at her belly, of being invisible while the world passed her by. She thought of her father, his grease-stained hands guiding hers, his voice whispering that engines would always speak if she just listened. And then she looked at Lena, whose belief had brought her here, and at Bolt, who wagged his tail as if he understood everything. Finally, she nodded. "If you permit, I will try." The words, spoken once in defiance, now carried triumph. From that day forward, the city no longer overlooked Amara Lewis. Headlines hailed her as the girl who saved the billionaire's dream, the prodigy mechanic who had outshone the experts. But for her, the glory was secondary. What mattered was that she had proven herself, that her father's lessons had not been wasted, that she had been given not charity but recognition. And as the falcon sat gleaming in the Harlow garage, alive and eternal, Amara knew this was only the beginning. Sometimes the greatest talents are hidden in the shadows. Sometimes the people the world refuses to see are the ones who carry its brightest light. And sometimes the smallest voice saying, "If you permit, I will try," is enough to change everything.